from New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We're going to start it once again today with the markets. And Abigail Doolittle is here. And Abigail, I must say, it feels like sort of an indecisive summer day. Not a lot of volume, not a lot of direction.
I would agree with you on that, David. Certainly a quiet Friday summer. As you mentioned, not a lot of volume, not a lot of direction. At this point, we're looking at stocks fluctuating here in the U.S. Where we have some outperformance is for the biotech index, and that has to do with Goldman saying that Moderna's vaccine may be able to be accelerated in some ways. That's being discounted a little bit, so that's really helping out that area. But where we see weakness, the FANG index down 0.9% on the weakness around Netflix, along with those other big cap techs. That puts net the S&P 500 again fluctuating between very small gains and losses. On the week, though, David, it's a different story, and it's pretty interesting because it's also a different story from what we've had over the last few weeks. So we have the S&P 500 higher on the week for the third week in a row, but we have the NASDAQ down, its first down week in 3 weeks, and a lot of that does have, of course, to do with Netflix having its worst week since 2019. They put up a disappointing quarter, I should say, a messy second quarter, but really weighing on the stock, the subscriber view for the third quarter. And David, an important piece of information comes out of that Netflix result, and what's happening with the stock on the week down 11% is the fact that these stocks have been up so much out of the March low, these stay-at-home stocks, these big tech stocks. It tells us investors have priced them to perfection. They want perfection. If the results are messy in any way, you're going to see a sell-off. So that might be something that we'll see in the next 2 weeks when the Apples and Amazons and other stocks start to report their June quarters as well, David.
Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Well, the coronavirus is surging in so many areas around the country with more than 75,000 new cases in the United States in the last 24 hours alone. One of the places hardest hit is Houston, and we welcome now Dr. Marc Boom. He is the president and CEO of Houston Methodist Hospital Center. It's one of the largest hospital areas in the hospitals in the area, has 2,300 beds and 24,000 employees. Dr. Boom, welcome back. Good to have you here. There are so many numbers we're hearing from around the country and from Houston. What are the numbers we really should pay attention to? Is it number of hospital beds? Is it deaths? Is it positivity? What should we be paying attention to?
Yeah, it can get quite confusing, and there's, obviously a lot of numbers we all look at, but I think of it in sort of stages. So the first thing to look at is the kind of real-time indicator of how many infections are we seeing in the community, and that will tend to, sort of foreshadow 6-7 days later the number of hospitalizations and where that direction will go. And then, of course, the average patient who either goes home in a few days or the patient who sadly, dies eventually after a long illness, we'll see those deaths happen even later than that. So you kind of see those in stages. So Houston's kind of a good news, bad news situation right now. We saw, thankfully, the cases level off in the community and start to plateau at a very disturbingly high level, but plateau nonetheless. And then about 8 days later, we saw the hospitalizations start to plateau. So for the last week or so, we've had plateauing of the hospitalizations. The problem we've got is that for the last week or so, we've seen the cases in the community go back up. We think what happened was the 4th of July, and as we were predicting and fearing, about a week after the 4th of July, we started seeing that tick up. And so we're really, steeling ourselves for a few days from now, starting to see upticks again in the hospitalizations. And we never really came down. We just plateaued. So in our system, for example, we went up 7-fold from Memorial Day to, where we peaked about 8-9 days ago, and have stayed essentially steady at that level, plus or minus a few patients. So we have 720 or so, 725 patients with COVID in-house each and every one of those days, with a large number being admitted, a large number being discharged. And so we're very concerned that we are going to be going up and seeing that again here sometime in the next few days.
How do you assess your ability at Houston Methodist to keep up with this at this point? I mean, after all, you've been doing it for quite a while now. Your people must be pretty tired.
Yeah, it's a challenge. We're going to be pushing 5 months pretty soon here. We saw our first patient with COVID right at the beginning of March, and that was travel related at the time. Rapidly increased. Saw 250 COVID or worked up for COVID patients at peak the first time around. And, if you look at a graph of that now, you realize that was not a mountain that we thought we were climbing at the time. It was a foothill for what we're seeing today, which is the mountain we're climbing. And unfortunately, as I said, we've come to a crest. What we don't know now is, are we going to see a whole nother mountain, continuing up, or can we bring this down? We had a masking order go into place 2 weeks ago today, mandatory masking across the state. I think there's no question that has helped in flattening things out initially, but immediately thereafter, we also had the 4th of July, and I'm just still concerned that, with a lot of what we saw, in spite of a lot of preaching and warnings, we still saw people celebrate a little too vigorously, and we're now going to pay the price for that a little bit. I'm hopeful with masking, though, that in this next week we can bend that back down, and that's really the key question. We don't know, and if we can't in the next week, frankly, we'll need to have more significant restrictions in place.
Dr. Boom, what do you need at this point, if anything? We saw that Governor Cuomo just today said he's going to send some people from New York down to help out with some testing in Houston. What is it that you need the most?
Well, from a hospital system perspective, we're fine on testing. I mean, we can do 3,500 tests a day if we need to. We've never quite needed to do that many. We've been in the 2,000 to 2,500 range at peak, which is an awful lot of people obviously getting tested. We're still seeing positivity rates in the 23, 24%. So you can do the math and see some days we're just our system alone, we're diagnosing large numbers of people. And we're fine right now on the personal protective equipment. Our staff are tired. Our staff are frustrated. Our staff, honestly, are watching people struggle, watching people sometimes die, watching people have difficulty breathing. And they go out in the community and sometimes see, behaviors and attitudes that just are completely, almost diametrically opposed to what they're seeing in the hospitals, and people not realizing that. If I had one call for action, it's unity. It's a community that works together, and everybody recognizes there's scientific evidence and there's scientific advice to do the right things. And together, when we are all unified, we actually can accomplish that. I am quite certain of that, but it takes really everybody doing their part. And we're doing much better than we were 2, 3, 4 weeks ago, but we still aren't at those levels we need to get to as a community to really bring this in control.
Dr. Boom, give us a sense of the demographics here. We've seen back in New York, the real problem was with the elderly and people with underlying conditions. Is that shifting some? Because we seem to see more younger people now hospitalized with COVID-19.
It has shifted. We still see the preponderance of people getting particularly ill tend to be older and have risk factors. But we've seen many more young people hospitalized. And, the reality is, while on average a younger person does better, if you have enough sick young people, some of them are going to do really poorly. And we've had our first 2 patients over the last 10 days or so under the age of 30 who passed away. It was really devastating, obviously, to those families, devastating to our staff who are caring for them. We had one young individual come into one of the hospitals and literally was melting away and passed away within about 5 or 6 hours. We had another who actually was related to some of our staff, so that was really tough. We've had pregnant women. We have one pregnant mom who delivered twins and is on a breathing tube right now, after her baby's born. So this can really affect people at all ages. We tend to see obesity, diabetes, probably smoking and vaping as some risk factors that we're seeing in people under 50. And of course, diabetes, obesity, we're seeing, all the way on up as significant risk factors. The good news embedded in all of this, or better news, I guess, is that we have lower mortality rates. And some of that is a shift in age. Some of that is a shift in risk factors. So we are seeing that people with more risk factors, whether that's age or whether that's underlying medical conditions, seem to be more careful and less frequently infected right now than some people who don't have those risk factors. So that has led to much better mortality, along with, many treatments and advances that I think are paying dividends. Not to mention that when you take, skilled clinicians, and they've now been doing this and have cared, we've cared for well over 3,000 inpatients now across our system. And, they gain experience, and it's like a heart surgeon who does bypass surgery. You want to go to somebody who's done a ton in their career, not somebody who has just done a few. And it's the same thing here. The experience, I think, really matters, and really proud of our clinicians.
I'm sure it
the
does.
results they're getting are great.
Yeah, I'm sure that's all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Boom. It's really good to have that report. That's Dr. Marc Boom. He is the president and CEO of the Houston Methodist Hospital Center down in Houston. Coming up here, we're going to talk with Jane Harman. She's the head of the Wilson Center, about that critical EU summit taking place over in Brussels. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It is time now for First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you very much. Dr. Anthony Fauci is optimistic there could be a new treatment for the coronavirus by autumn. The infectious diseases chief spoke to Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg in a live event. Dr. Fauci says he expects results for a clinical trial on monoclonal antibodies in the next few months. That underscores the speed at which the government has been working to quickly approve and roll out a treatment. India has become the third country to record at least 1 million coronavirus cases. The virus curve there didn't flatten despite imposing an expansive lockdown in March. Only the U.S. and Brazil have had more cases. India's population is more than double those two combined. That suggests the virus has more room to run. Israel is taking sweeping action in response to a new surge of coronavirus cases. The country will shut down on weekends. The closures impact stores, gyms, tourist sites, and beaches. Restaurants in Israel will also be closed for on-site dining. The restrictions come as 1,900 new daily cases were reported, and after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has faced widespread criticism and protests over his handling of the pandemic, said, quote, interim steps are needed to avoid another general lockdown. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel is raising doubts about reaching agreement on a landmark $855 billion recovery fund this week. In Brussels, EU leaders are meeting in person for the first time in 5 months. The Chancellor says the differences remain very, very great. Among them, how the money will be distributed and how the rules dictating how funds will be greenlighted. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. We're going to pick up now on that report that Mark just gave us about the negotiations from the EU leaders over in Brussels that are taking place right now about a possible recovery package. And we want to bring in Jane Harman. She is the president of the Wilson Center, beg your pardon, in Washington. Jane, thank you very much for being with us. Great to have you with us. Give us a sense of how important this is to the future of Europe.
It's a huge deal. It is all about whether Europe can take advantage of the momentum from its pretty effective crackdown on the rise of COVID and then provide help. I mean, Europe does something that we don't. We have unemployment insurance. They have employment insurance. And so they have people ready to go back to work, and they're opened up for travel inside Europe, but not to us. I don't blame them. Why should they allow us in with our soaring rates of COVID? So this will determine whether or not Europe can be an integrated EU, or we'll go to a two-tier structure with countries like Spain and Italy on the outside. I'm bullish about this working. I think Angela Merkel, whose birthday it is today, happy birthday, Angela, age 66, I'm bullish about her leadership. She was so unpopular in Germany, and now I gather her approval rating is over 70%. Wouldn't President Trump kill for that? And I think she's with a scientific background and a no-nonsense personality, very well equipped to forge something this weekend.
Yeah, and I think that some of that popularity has come from the way she's handled actually COVID-19 over there. Yeah. Let's turn to something else that's really very much in the news these days. Over the last 48 hours or so, we've had 2 different hacks, one involving Twitter with some very prominent names involved, but also a claim of Russia trying to hack into some of the virus, the work on the vaccine. Tell us what that says about cybersecurity right now as we head into an election on the one hand and also trying to fight the pandemic on the other.
It's not good news. These are not the same thing. The hack into the basic architecture of Twitter was definitely involved compromising some folks inside Twitter, whether they were part of the group that hacked or whether they were inadvertently part of the group that hacked. It's still bad news for Twitter. And obviously, it's cyber hygiene needs a lot of work. But what they got was the administrative accounts. That's the basic architecture that Twitter has, and it was a Bitcoin attack. So somebody was making money out of it, and they obviously did. But what I worry about is not only that they get that stuff, but then they plant disinformation in people's accounts, and they say things that are clearly not true and reach gigantic audiences, because Twitter is now a a very popular medium for politicians, not just our president, to communicate on. So that's that one hack. And then you asked about stealing COVID information. That's a different set of alarming issues. That is Russia following on China and others, trying to get inside information about the cures and the progress of cures for COVID. I mean, if we could have a vaccine by year end, please be right, Anthony Fauci, please be right. If we could have that, and that is in the U.S. Intellectual property domain, wouldn't other countries like to steal that? And so I think that's what that set of challenges is. Bottom line, though, David, at least the way I see this is, we have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can't be solely focused on COVID, and we can't be solely focused on the election. These things are going to, we have to do both, and we have to understand that bad guys, whether they're terrorists, they're sometimes foreign competitors, they're rogue elements, they're criminal elements, are taking advantage because we're distracted.
So Jane, I'm mindful of the fact that before you went to the Wilson Center, you had a long and distinguished career in the Congress, representing the state of California, and you served as the ranking Democratic member on the House Intelligence Committee. Is this a matter of there are things we're not doing we should be doing to protect ourselves from this cyber hacking, or is it that the technology has just gotten ahead of us? There's nothing that we, as the government at least, can do?
Well, I never say nothing can be done. If I weren't an optimist, why would I have run for Congress and served for 9 terms? So I am an optimist. Sure, there's more we can do. The technology is evolving, and the bad guys, whoever they are taking advantage of that. We have to be nimble. We have to have policies and laws that allow us to be nimble. We have to recruit the smartest people. Think the people who are doing this hacking are not my age. They're not grandmas. They're probably the age of, well, my grandkids are still too young, but they're 20-year-olds, and they're enormously clever, and they have skill sets that we have to emulate. We have to hire 20-year-olds ourselves. So you asked, is there more we can do? Yes. I worry that our intelligence community has been undermined by some of the purges, if that's a fair word, that have gone on recently in this administration. People have been removed as inspectors general. People have been removed from senior levels in the various intelligence agencies. And I think that turnover hurts. And let's understand, it's not, these agencies don't run themselves. They have to be given direction. The leadership should be saying, turn over every rock, listen to under law, whatever you can, figure out where this stuff is coming from, so that policymakers, who are not the same thing as the intelligence analysts, can form the best policy. And that's the part that I think isn't happening. We're not having forward-leaning, aggressive use of proper intelligence tools to inform policymakers who are interested not just in what tactic will we employ tomorrow, but what's our strategy against these threats, which are going to keep multiplying and coming at us.
And then just briefly, if we can, Jane, what about China? Because we've been very focused on Huawei and China with cybersecurity. The two things we were talking about don't have to do with China, but how vulnerable are we there?
Well, China is a strategic competitor, just like Russia. They're not the same economy. China's economy is much more successful than Russia's economy. But China has a long-range strategy, which we lack. And, their leadership is staying for a longer term than ours, at least that's what it would seem to be. And Huawei, which is a Chinese company that has developed the most extensive amount of software and hardware for our next telecommunications level, 5G, Huawei is the only technology that parts of the world can buy. We haven't invested, and we should have invested. As a government, especially, we should have created the circumstances so that our industry would invest and create an effective alternative to Huawei. Where we are now is we're telling our firms, don't buy Huawei. Britain has just emulated us and said, don't buy Huawei at the end of this year. And what should they buy? Right. And what will happen when a lot of the world does buy Huawei? Will there be a 2-tier communication system? That would be a calamity.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. It's great to have you with us, as always, Jane. That's Jane Harman. She is the president and CEO of the Wilson Center. And we have some potentially important breaking news right now. Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the Supreme Court now is reported is being treated for cancer. She has dealt with cancer before and has come back each time. As we know, she's been hospitalized with reports of infection. Reportedly, this is unrelated to that, but they now have discovered the recurrence of cancer. We will cover this very carefully as the story develops. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. To repeat the breaking news now, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the court says, is being treated for a recurrence of cancer, although the court is careful to say she will remain on the court. We know she's battled cancer before and has come back. We will keep following that as the story develops. In the meantime, we don't have a stock of the hour. We have a whole index of the hour this time, and it has to do with malls, and Scarlett Fu is here to take us through it.
That's right, David. Regional malls really just cannot catch a break. I think about what Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York said today, which is that New York City is entering phase 4, the final stage of reopening, yet indoor malls will remain closed. And of course, governors and mayors around the rest of the country are also warning of taking drastic action if infections don't start to go down. Adding to that, you had consumer sentiment souring as well. The U-Michigan Sentiment Index unexpectedly falling for this month, reversing most of June's gain. So if you look at how malls have performed, they're down about 7% over the past 10 days. By contrast, other consumer-facing companies, cyclicals, are up about 3% over the same period. Now, the mall index that we're following includes Simon Property, Taubman Center, Macerich. A lot of these companies have outdoor malls. Simon owns Woodbury Commons, for instance. But foot traffic is nowhere back to pre-COVID levels, and there's no visibility on when we will get a recovery either. And the damage has really been done over the longer term. So far this year, you can see shopping malls is at the very bottom there, down about 56%. David?
Thank you so much to Scarlett Fu with a report on the malls. In the meantime, coming up here, we're going to go to Basil Smikle, next Democratic strategist. Among other things, we're going to ask him about whether the Supreme Court now is going to be front and center in the election. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We welcome now Basil Smikle. He is a lecturer at Columbia University and former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. Basil, welcome back. Good to have you here. I want to start with this news that broke just a few moments ago, and that is that Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg says that she's had a recurrence of her cancer, that she's going to have bi-weekly cancer treatments for that, chemotherapy treatments, but she says it leaves her fully able to participate in the court. We wish her all the very best, and we certainly don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. We hope that she has a long career on the Supreme Court. She's already battled cancer several times before. At the same time, the Supreme Court is necessarily a political issue at this point, certainly something that President Trump would like to run on. What are the possible political consequences of just it becoming an issue about the Supreme Court as we go into November?
Well, it certainly will become an issue, and in many ways it already is, in that we've been focused so much on the Supreme Court in the last few weeks, with the exception of a ruling with respect to the Affordable Care Act. There have been a lot of decisions that have come down over the last few weeks that have actually gone against President Trump and the administration. So they very much would like to be able to turn the tide, if you will. What you've seen in the lower courts, however, is that the president has been successful at stacking the court with his nominees. In fact, he's been more successful than any other president since Carter in terms of placing a number of like-minded judges on the federal courts. And so he would relish an opportunity to sort of continue to remake the Supreme Court, and having had two justices already appointed to that body. Of course, we don't want to see it under these circumstances, but the judicial appointments are not only important for the Republican Party broadly, but certainly something that this president has consistently tried to hang his hat on.
Exactly, and he's not the first one that's tried to run on the Supreme Court and the importance of the influence of the Supreme Court. But at the same time, the last term sort of indicated, did it not, that there's a limit to how political you can get with the Supreme Court, because Chief Justice Roberts clearly did not vote the way perhaps President Trump would have liked him to vote, and not just him as a Trump appointee. So is this something that motivates voters to get out and vote on the Democratic side as well as the Republican side?
You know, historically, it hasn't been as motivating a factor for Democrats as it has been for Republicans. But I do think, given that this president has already placed 2 justices on the Supreme Court, there is incredible amount of attention being placed on this particular president's political leanings and the sort of the mechanics around the appointment of judges that has already taken place. So I do think there's renewed attention on the courts and on the judicial system, and the focus being on a lot of the policies that the courts have stopped the president from doing. And so, so that's why I think that Democrats are paying a lot closer attention than they have previously on these appointments.
Whether you're a Democrat or Republican, pretty much everybody across the country is paying a lot of attention to the coronavirus right now. There's a new poll out from the Washington Post and the ABC News really indicating that the distrust of President Trump's handling of this issue, the virus, the pandemic, is growing. And the thing that jumped out at me was 52% in that poll indicated they had deep distrust. They really didn't approve of what President Trump was doing.
Yeah, if you even look at some of his early supporters, or at least the folks who did vote for him in 2016 come November of that cycle, you look at suburban voters and you look at older voters. He's starting to lose traction and significant support among older voters, particularly in the state of Florida. And why is that important? It's important because Florida was previously not a state that Democrats are looking at. Now that state is in play, largely because you have older Americans who spent a good portion of their career sort of planning for this part in their lives. And because of the way the president has handled this virus and the economy, they have real concerns about both their health and financial well-being. And as a result of that, they're saying to themselves, well, you know what? Maybe this isn't the president that we need right now managing this country through this pandemic. And that level of concern should be a wake-up call for this president. And you've seen, obviously, changes in his campaign team, I guess, reflecting the concern that the president himself has.
So you've been in the room, as it were, for these sorts of things. Does changing the staff on your campaign staff really make that big a difference? Isn't it ultimately the candidate and what the candidate is saying and doing?
Ultimately, it is the candidate, and I don't think anyone should look at these changes in his campaign structure and suggest that they will have a substantial impact on how the president actually governs. What the impact will be felt basically on the ground, and how the operation itself and the infrastructure is actually managed. And one of the things that I would caution for anyone looking at this race, if you remember back in 1988, George Bush was actually losing quite substantially to Michael Dukakis around the same time. And if you remember, in September was the launch of the Willie Horton ad. It was a racially charged ad that was meant to evoke a certain sense of fear and apprehension about voting for Democrats. I'm not suggesting that that kind of tactic will specifically be used. Right. My guess is that it will be something along those lines. But my point, though, is that there is time enough for a campaign to inject certain tactics that are meant to excite voters that previously they had not been excited. So I think that when you have a change in personnel in the way that you have, it's meant to do those kinds of shakeups of the organization of the infrastructure.
Okay, Basil, always a pleasure to have you with us. That's Basil Smikle. He's a lecturer at Columbia University and former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. And now it is time for Bloomberg First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you very much. The UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson is nudging Britons to go back to their offices in an attempt to revive the economy. The Prime Minister said that starting August 1st, employers will have more discretion to bring workers back in. Still, Mr. Johnson's top scientific advisor says there's no reason to change his guidance for people to work from home if they can. The White House is drawing a line in the sand for the next coronavirus aid bill. Officials say President Trump could reject a measure passed by Congress if it doesn't include a payroll tax cut. Democrats are solidly opposed, and even Republicans are said to be cool to the idea. Former Trump communications chief Anthony Scaramucci wants to see the president humiliated in November. The founder of Stonebridge Capital says President Trump is, quote, obviously incompetent. Scaramucci is now seeking Republican votes for Joe Biden. Scaramucci lasted only 11 days in the communications job before he was fired. The president called him a highly unstable nut job. Political novice Jamal Bowman scored an upset victory over veteran House Democrat Eliot Engel in New York's primary, part of a show of strength by progressives in a state that is replacing some longtime incumbents with younger, more diverse candidates. The 44-year-old Bowman was declared the winner in the contest, all but assuring an election in November from the solidly Democratic district he represents. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Coming up next, we're going to talk with Dr. Raj Shah. He's the head of the Rockefeller Foundation on their very dramatic plan to really expand coronavirus testing across the country. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, in the last 24 hours, there have been more than 75,000 new cases of coronavirus in the country, indicating that we are far from the end of this disease. The Rockefeller Foundation has a proposal for how we can really do systematic testing throughout the country, and they now are announcing the second phase of this, really taking up another notch with new technology. We welcome now Dr. Raj Shah. He is the head of the Rockefeller Foundation. So Raj, welcome back. It's great to have you here. Give us a sense of what this second phase does as opposed to the first.
Well, thanks for having me, David. The reality is America is facing an absolute crisis. As you just said, 75,000 cases, highest we've ever had. We're about to have a new flu season this fall, when Americans will have about 100 million cases of the sniffles. And if we can't tell the difference between COVID-19 and the common cold, it's going to paralyze institutions, schools, the economy, firefighters, everybody who's essential in our workforce and in our economy. So we need to get to 30 million tests a week. And right now we're at about 5 million. The only way to get there, this second phase, is based on a new set of technologies. They're new antigen tests made by manufacturers that are cheaper. They're slightly less sensitive than the traditional PCR tests that America has been using to date. But they can be used more frequently, they can be used more easily, they can often offer point-of-care results within 15 or 20 minutes. And our proposal is that essential workers in America, and that includes teachers, it includes healthcare workers, it includes firefighters, police officers, get tested far more frequently so they can go to work and know they're being safe when they do so through these lower cost, slightly less sensitive, but much more frequently used antigen tests. And we've laid out a plan to help America get there. It costs $75 billion. We're asking Congress and the federal government to consider that investment as they consider the next stimulus bill. And we think it's the only way out between a major catastrophe in the fall, when we may have to shut down the American economy again, and losing hundreds of thousands of American lives that we don't need to lose.
Raj, there's the issue of how many people are getting tested. You've laid out the numbers of where we should be as opposed to where we are, of how often you get tested. There's also how fast the test results get back, because we're seeing in some places you have 5, 7, 8 days. It's so long before you get it back that you can't do the sort of contact tracing you need to do.
You're 100% right. Speed is everything. It's even more important than accuracy once you get above about 80 or 85% sensitivity. Today, the average test return time is 5 to 7 days in America. There's new data out of Harvard, out of Yale, out of Colorado that show that most of the infection actually happens within a couple of days of people seeking a test. So if you get a result a week later, it's basically like you didn't get tested. because you've been infecting folks for a week. And so the reality is we need to optimize the way we're doing those PCR tests. Those are clinical diagnostic tests. And part of that optimization is to move a lot of the basic screening tests that people might do. A teacher, for example, on an every other week basis in Colorado might want to get a screening test, but they should do it using these new antigen tests or other new low-cost, frequently applied and point of care and point of service tests that will become available between now and early November.
Yeah, Dr. Shah, there's the issue of gathering the data, having it available, and the question is, who gets the data? We've had a development just this week with the Department of Health and Human Services deciding the CDC no longer should get the data from the hospitals to go to HHS, and some websites seem to have shut down. Is this a matter of, as HHS says, getting it more efficiently, more effectively, or is there a problem here with maybe our not getting the data that we need?
Well, it's probably both. I mean, I don't know the details of that particular issue in terms of why they chose to make that change and what's more efficient in the new regime. I do think what's critically important actually is that patients, people who are getting screened, get the data and get it quickly. Look, today in America, professional sports franchises in baseball and basketball, in the NFL, they're all going to test their players and their coaches, and they're going to get them results in a reasonable amount of time, 12 hours, 15 hours, 24 hours. We should be treating teachers. We should be treating firefighters. We should be treating healthcare workers like pro basketball players. Those folks are the ones that should be getting tested. And they should be doing it because they run America's essential institutions, and they are the only chance we have. Keeping them at work safely is the only chance we have of avoiding another national lockdown, and doing it at a time when, as you point out, cases are absolutely spiking. So getting the data back to those people quickly and supporting them with contact tracing and isolation when they're positive and fast is the only way to prevent this new massive spike in cases from really becoming debilitating to the American economy throughout the fall. This will get worse before it gets better if we don't take this modest $75 billion investment and action right now.
Well, let's come back to that modest action, as you say. In your plan, in your proposal, what happens with the data? How do we make sure that we have effective use of that data for the people who need it, not just the individuals involved, but also for public health officials, for school districts, for states?
Yeah, so first and foremost, data goes to public health authorities that are local public health authorities. And at that point, and also it goes back to the individuals, obviously, who got the test and then need to be counseled into either some kind of further test. If they got a screening test, you may then want to get them a PCR diagnostic test, and also into isolation. The data nationally really does need to become much more open, because we're about to have some new technologies and tools that might allow us to understand, well, which community is starting to see increased prevalence of cases before even people show symptoms in that community. And the federal government needs to know that, local authorities need to know that, and frankly, that kind of data should be publicly available so that all the complex actors and decision makers can see that. And there's some new technologies, including wastewater monitoring and other things, that may make that more possible in the coming months. America needs a surveillance system, a screening system, and a clinical diagnostic system. And $75 billion of investment to get there will save us hundreds of billions of dollars of lost economic activity per month if we act now and if we act aggressively, so that we don't get overwhelmed in the fall.
And finally, Raj, is the horse already out of the barn in some parts of the country right now? Because we look at positivity rates. We just talked to somebody from Houston, and they're in the plus 20% in the positivity and the testing. At some point, don't you have to get the virus down some before the testing even can be effective?
Yes, absolutely. In southern Florida, I think a third of all children that are getting tested are testing positive. That calls for much more dramatic and drastic actions. But the reality is, unless we have a data system that makes testing broadly available to everybody, collects that data and uses it more effectively, as you pointed out, we're going to be stuck between shutting the economy down or just letting people die. And that's not something we can ricochet back and forth between across so many communities in America. So some hotspots will, I suspect, need to really shut down in order to get back on track. But getting back on track requires testing, and testing is the only way to have a data-driven response. The Rockefeller Foundation works with Republican and Democratic mayors and governors across the country. This is not a partisan issue. This is really a patriotic issue. And we have a chance right now with the coming stimulus bill to make the right investments. We have the chance for the public sector to work with these private companies who may otherwise, simply sell their testing capacity to the highest bidders on the private market and leave low-income school communities exposed, for example. And we need to act together. We're on this together. We've got to act that way now.
Raj, thank you so much for being with us on that very, very important study that you have, the proposal you have on testing. That is Dr. Raj Shah. He is the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. In the meantime, a program note, tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll have the next episode of Wall Street Week. We'll be joined by Larry Summers of Harvard, Catherine Baker of University of Chicago, and Saira Malik of Nuveen. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Earlier this hour, we learned in a statement from Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg that she is once again battling cancer. She says that she is fully able to continue to participate in court activities. At the same time, she's having bi-weekly chemotherapy treatments. Welcome now, Jordan Rubin. He is from Bloomberg Law. So, Jordan, give us your best reporting on what's going on with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
We learned today in a statement that Justice Ginsburg put out through the Supreme Court that she is undergoing treatment for a recurrence of cancer. She said that a periodic scan in February, followed by a biopsy, revealed lesions on her liver, but she was careful to point out that the treatment so far, the chemotherapy treatment that she's undergoing, has proved to be successful. So it does seem that Justice Ginsburg is headed in the right direction, and she also made sure to note that she's kept up with her opinion writing and all other court work. And as she said in the past, I would remain a member of the court so long as I can do the job full steam, and she made clear in her statement that she said she's remaining fully able to do that.
So, Jordan, there's never a good time to have cancer, I think it's fair to say. But if you're a Supreme Court justice, this is not the busiest time of their term. They've already ended their last term. They haven't begun their new term yet. And traditionally, Supreme Court justices go home and they sort of work on some cert petitions and things, but they don't have quite the same caseload. So is this a good time for her to really fight this cancer?
Well, what's interesting, David, is that the scenario you laid out in terms of it getting a little quieter right after the term is often the case. However, this week has been incredibly busy behind the scenes at the Supreme Court. They haven't been hearing arguments, but in a series of late-night orders related to the death penalty, the justices have handed down opinions at 2 and 3 in the morning. So Justice Ginsburg and the rest of the justices have been working even more than full steam than usual, even though the public isn't seeing them argue cases. They really haven't even fully gone on a break just yet. So as you mentioned, no good time to have it, but this has been an especially busy time for the Supreme Court, even if traditionally in the past it hasn't always been.
Justice Ginsburg is 87 years old, and we have to all be concerned about our health as we get up in 8 years. This is also not her first go-around with cancer, is it?
That's correct. Justice Ginsburg is a 4-time cancer survivor. She's also been in the hospital for other issues not cancer-related, which she noted her other recent hospitalizations, for example, to remove gallstones and to treat an infection, which we also learned about recently. She said those were unrelated to cancer. So certainly in terms of health, the world has thrown a lot at Justice Ginsburg, but she's one of the toughest ones out there, and she's been going strong despite everything.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Give us a sense of the process at the Supreme Court. Who decides whether she's up to serving or not? Is that entirely left up to her, or is there any mechanism by which the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice or otherwise, can say, we really think you better step back?
Formally, it's really up to the justice themselves, as it is with many other aspects of the court. Certainly, there have been times throughout the Supreme Court's history where perhaps it's been suggested to a justice within the court that maybe now is a good time to step down. There's not any indication that that's been happening within the court when it comes to Justice Ginsburg, but it's really something that's her decision. And as she's always said, she's going to stay on the court so long as she can do the job full steam. And the latest that we have today from her in the court is that's not going to change anytime soon.
Okay, Jordan, really appreciate you being with us. That's Jordan Rubin of Bloomberg Law reporting on Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And once again, she's a very pivotal figure on the Supreme Court of the United States. She's had cancer before, and I know we all wish her only the very best. Coming up in the second hour of Balance of Power, we will be on radio, and we will have Richard Trumka. He is the president, of course, of the AFL-CIO, which has over 12.5 million workers that it represents. We're going to talk to him about this financial cliff coming up if Congress doesn't adopt something like the HEROES Act. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, and we've been on TV.